let's start our discussion on fundamental rights and freedoms. What are fundamental rights and freedoms? Can anybody tell me that? What are fundamental rights and freedoms?
Sir, certain rights given by the Constitution as a way of the citizens.
Alright, so acts provide well rights provided by the Constitution that would defend, the interest of the citizens, right? That help to protect the citizens. Okay, most likely would be that. Provided within the Bill of Rights enshrined in our different constitutions, entrenched within our different constitutions. So hopefully, we know where the Bill of Rights exists within our different constitutions. I think for Jamaica is Section 3. So remember, right, these things are important. It sets aside somebody who is getting a 2 in law versus somebody who's going to get a distinction, right? So these things are different. Okay? So overview now. So the fundamental rights and freedoms, we know that these are the basic human rights and liberties that are considered to be inherited by all individuals, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, gender, religion, anything, any status, right? These are essential for the dignity, freedom, and equality of individuals existing within the society, and these are enshrined in the constitutions of democratic countries and international human rights documents. These are important. Okay. No. Okay. Let's not jump the gun. I don't want to jump the gun. All right. So let's move on. So we have different rights. The right to life is an example, right? So it's essential for the enjoyment of all other rights and freedoms. This is a very important right. Because without this, all else won't exist. Won't generally matter, right? Because if you don't have the right to life, what do you have the right to after that, right? So you have the right to life, right? So it is recognized in numerous international human rights documents and national constitutions, right? So have an inherent right to life, right? Right to life is inherent to every human being, right? It means in it's a nature, right? This means that it's a nature and essential right that every person possesses by virtue of being human. This screams natural law, right? Also, the protection by states. So states are obligated to protect the right to life through their legal and institutional frameworks. This includes enacting laws and establishing mechanisms to prevent and punish arbitrary deprivation of life. That's where we have things like why is murder illegal and manslaughter and all these things illegal, because it's defending the right to live. All right. Case law. Nilabati Behira versus the state of Orissa and others. This is an Indian case, by the way. This is a case coming from India, right? I was trying to think of a simple Caribbean case to use, but mm, mm, mm. All right. But we're looking at this right to life here, right? What happened in this case? Does anybody know this case?
No, sir.
No. Anyone else? Okay. Nobody, bro. Okay, so this is basically a it's a standard homicide case, right? Right? So it's a standard homicide case here. So basically what was happening, right? So this I think it was a 20-year-old man, right, was taken into custody by the police, right? In investigation with theft, right? Because it was theft at first, right? So we had that there, right? So his mother would have visited him while he's in custody, etc., right? And the following day he was just found dead near I think a railway track, right? So he was found dead, and this was in the custody of the state, right? So there was a petition being put out, right? The police denied responsibility, saying that he escaped and he ran down to the train tracks and he subsequently died there, right? But there was a petition, right, that was instated, right? Wrote to the Supreme Court, right? That okay, let me let in this person. The ring just completely stopped me in the tracks, right? So the petitioner, right, wrote to the Supreme Court a letter which the court treated as a writ, right, letter, as initiating a claim for contravention of the fundamental right to life guaranteed by the Constitution, right? So looking at here now, the Supreme Court would have directed, right, a judge, right, to hold an inquiry into the facts. So judicial review was done, right? So the judge reported that the deceased has died from multiple injuries on him while in police custody. So what we're seeing here now, the state took this person in. It does not matter what the person had done. It doesn't matter what crime they have done. The state must uphold the fundamental rights of the prisoner to live, right? So because the police, as members of the state there, right, are, well, state workers, right, actually um allowed for these things to occur within police custody, right? The state would have disputed the findings here and alleged that the deceased escaped and stuff like that, right? But all of these injuries were succumbed to the victim, right? While in police custody. So the state had breached the deceased's fundamental right to life. Because even though he had committed theft, even though he had committed a crime, he still had the right to live. You took away his right to liberty, which is imprisonment, right? They imprisoned him, right? Took away his right to liberty, right? But he still had the right to live, right? And any type of death or anything like that that occurs within police custody is generally a breach of the fundamental right of life, right? Or right to life. So compensation through damages, which is a remedy of judicial review, was given to the mother. That makes sense, right? The case makes sense? The man died within police custody, so the state infringed upon the fundamental right to life. That makes sense?
Yes, sir.
Alright, go ahead. Okay, everything's fine. Oh, let's go. So the right to personal liberty now. Right, so we're looking at here now the right of persons to basically, this right basically safeguard them from any type of arbitrary detention, right? So you can't just lock up anybody because of lock up sake, right? These things are protected by the state. So the freedom from arbitrary detention is a part of the personal liberty, right? We're looking at they have the right to not to be subjugated to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile, or any deprivation of liberty, right? So any deprivation actually must be lawful, necessary, and proportionate. We also have the due process law under natural law, which we'll look at, right? We'll look at natural law through there, right? So the right detention must be established through legal procedures, etc. You can't just lock up somebody like that. You can't just take away their personal liberty, right? The case here is Ramesh Maharaj versus the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, right? I think it's Trinidad, right? Well, the Trinidad and Tobago case, right? 1976. What occurred in this case?
This is where a judge of the High Court of Trinidad and Tobago made an order committing the appellant to prison for several days for contempt of court. And
Barstow.
pardon?
The Barstow.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The barrister. So 7 days for contempt of court. And the appellant applied ex parte by a motion to another high court judge, claiming in purported pursuance of subsection 6 of the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago in 1962, a redress for alleged contravention of his rights under that section of the Constitution not to be deprived of liberty except by due process of the law. So the redress was inter alia, among other things, an order for immediate release from prison pending fine determination of the motion, and damages for wrongful detention and false imprisonment against the respondent was representative of the state. Was a representative of the state.
Okay, lovely. So the issue here was that the judge failed to inform, right, the appellant of the specific nature of the content. So he wasn't informed of anything. He was just thrown into jail, right? So there was no legal basis for this. So yes, okay, the judge said, I'm going to hold you in contempt. Okay. Why? I don't know. You didn't inform me. You just threw me into prison. No, no, no. That's a breach of the right to personal liberty. All right. So we had that there, and you gave a lovely description of the case. Thank you for that. All right. So we had that there. The freedom from slavery and forced labor. Right. So freedom from slavery and forced labor is a fundamental human right that prohibits individuals from being subjected to conditions of slavery, servitude, or forced labor. So this right is enshrined in various international human rights instruments and national laws, and is essential for the protection of human dignity and autonomy. The case law here: Attorney General versus Williams, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Queen versus Luchman, Guyana, 2008. Which one of these cases can you guys tackle? Can tackle any of these cases? Well, I guess I'm up then. Alright. So Attorney General versus Williams, right? So generally, in this case, the respondent, a former domestic worker, claimed she had been held in conditions amounting to slavery or servitude by her employees in Trinidad and Tobago, right? She alleged that she was forced to work excessive hours without pay and was subjected to physical and psychological abuse. What was the entire judgment of this case now? The court recognized that severe exploitation and coercive actions faced by the respondent, right? So looking at those things, right? We're looking at the recognition of the exploitation, right? It affirmed that such conditions violated her right to freedom from slavery and forced labor as protected by the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago and international human rights standards, right? So looking at that, so the right protected her from any type of exploitation and coercive acts, all right? Fine?
Yes, sir.
Okay. For Queen versus Luchman, right? It was a human trafficking case in which one of the person was actually recruited under false pretenses and subjected to forced labor and under deplorable conditions, right? There in 2000, generally in 2007, right? I think. So the court found the accused guilty. Obviously, it's human trafficking. So found guilty, right? And because of these offenses under human trafficking, being forced to do this forced labor, while the victim was under the entire trafficking ring, right? The court held, right, that this was against the Guyanese constitution, right, that protected the victim, right, protected the victim's dignity and freedom from exploitation, right? So looking at there, so the first case there is basically a type of servitude issue with workers and lack of pay, as well as physical and psychological abuse there, and the second case is about trafficking, human trafficking. All right. The freedom of movement now, you have the right to freely move within a country. As long as you're a citizen of the country, you can freely move, right? Within a country, you can freely go outside the country. You are free to leave the country, and you're free to return to the country. It is your own country. This right is crucial for personal autonomy and the exercise of other human rights, such as the right to work, education, and family life. The case, Ruddock versus Attorney General of Jamaica and Hunt, right, I guess, versus the Chief Immigration Officer, Barbados, right? So these two cases, what happened in Ruddock? Does anybody know? Does anybody know these two cases? Okay, so let me just go to the case law then. For Ruddock specifically, the appellants are Jamaican national because the right specifically speaks to nationals of the country, right, in which jurisdiction is, right? So he was a Jamaican national, right, who had been restricted from traveling, right, outside of the country due to an executive order, right, due to the executive order, right. The word executive is important, right. So he challenged the restriction as the violation of the constitutional right of freedom of movement, and the Supreme Court of Jamaica ruled in favor of the appellant, stating that the executive order was arbitrary and not justifiable under the Constitution, right? So the court emphasized the importance of procedural fairness and necessity for any restriction on movement to be based in unclear legal grounds. It doesn't mean that if you commit a crime now, the country should let you leave, But if the country restricts you to stay, right? There must be a lot of clear legal grounds being set for that executive order. It was a bit foggy, and for that reason, Ruddock could have actually appealed, right? Well, not really appealed. He could have challenged the matter. For the chief immigration officer now, that's issue now. What happened there, right? So we had a petition of a non-national resident of Barbados, right? So a non-national resident of Barbados was subject to deportation orders, right? He claimed, right, he claimed infringe upon his right of freedom of movement within Barbados and his right to family life, right? So he's a non-national resident now, but he put that forward. The High Court of Barbados found the deportation order to be in violation of his rights, stating that the petitioner has established sufficient ties to the country, right? The court emphasized that deportation must consider the individual's personal circumstances and rights. So looking at that. So the government of Barbados could not deport this person, right? Could not. Because the Supreme Court said that he had sufficient ties to the country, and since he was now protected under the freedom of movement, right, he couldn't just be deported like that, right? So there must be some clear stipulated grounds for the general deportation, right? But we're looking at that, right? So the case emphasized the balance between the state immigration control and the individual rights of freedom of movement and family life, setting a precedent for humane and rights respecting immigration policies in Barbados, right? So looking at that. So those are two cases under the freedom for movement. We also have freedom from torture and inhumane treatment. The principle asserts that no individual should be subjected to any form of physical and psychological torture or cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you to repeat what the precedent set was.
The precedent set for Barbados?
Yes, please.
Wait, what? What was that? What was that? Okay. I'll just agree that majority of our teachers are female, therefore, that makes sense. Alright, but go ahead. So what I'm saying is that the entire precedent set out, right? So it sets a precedent for the humane and rights respecting immigration policies, right? So the immigration policies of Barbados had to now be bound by that. Oh, you said yes, please. Okay. All right. So what's basically happening is that the policies set forth in Barbados now have to be bounded by humane and right respecting policies, right? Because of this case. So remember, as cases are established, the precedents are binding, right? Especially because it was done by the High Court of Barbados, right? So it set a precedence for those different policies to be more humane and right respecting. Make sense? Is that okay, Alan? All right. So the freedom from torture and inhumane treatment. Now, we know that torture cannot happen, right? We're saying that the individuals are free from any type of physiological or any type of psychological torture, any type of cruel or inhumane treatment, right? Torture can take many forms, including beatings, electric shock, sexual assault, solitary confinement, or any other methods intended to inflict severe physical or mental suffering. Well, let's look at these case laws. Pratt and Morgan versus the Attorney General of Jamaica, 1993. Could somebody go ahead with that case?
So I think it's about Pratt and Morgan being placed on death row for a long period of time, and I don't quite remember the case, but basically each time they were told that they would be executed, they had to wait, and I don't remember it that much.
Okay, so let's clear it up, right? Okay, does somebody want a chance to clear it up before I start? Cause she has the basis, but she want a little bit more, specificity. Anyone? Okay, I guess I'll go. So what happened here? The appellants were sentenced to be executed, which is allowed within the Jamaican Constitution, right? Via because they were convicted for murder, right? They're convicted for murder and sentenced to be executed, right? For each specific time they were told that they were going to be executed, they had to wait, right? They were on death row for 14 years, right? And they appealed to the Privy Council on the ground that the delay of their executions constituted cruel and inhumane treatment, right? So the undue delay, right, of the in hanging prisoners on death row could constitute cruel and inhumane punishment and was prohibited by the Constitution of Jamaica, right? So that was inhumane treatment there. And we had here now Thomas versus the Attorney General of Guyana. What happened here? Anybody knows this case? So what happened here, is that Thomas basically filed a constitutional motion of redress for breaches in his in the rights to not be deprived of liberty and the rights to be protected from inhumane and degrading treatment, right? So what occurred here now? Thomas was beaten, burnt, and suffered severe injuries, right, by serving members of the Guyana police force while he was in custody, right? So we're looking at those issues. He was arrested on the allegation of murder, but all of these different treatments. Thomas was 14 years old. His parents were not informed of his arrest, right? And he was detained for 4 days, right? While undergoing all these serious issues, right? So he was assaulted by the policemen. His hands were tied with pieces of wire. His jersey was wrapped around his head. He was choked and stomped on in his abdomen, and he was then set afire in his genital area. So looking at all of these different types of treatments being done, right? He was interviewed at the station by a person who claimed to be a medical doctor who prescribed medication, and eventually was taken to the hospital where he remained for 14 days. Right? So you can look at how this resulted in inhumane treatment, right? So what occurred here now? What do you think occurred? Let's pick it apart, right? Let's pick it apart. So there was no specific denial, right, in the detailed allegations of Thomas, right? So the allegations went through, right? The police force, right, is a public institution, right, and it's enshrined in the Constitution that they must be there for the best interests of the child, right, by principle, right? So look at the abuse of power by a public institution, right? The arrest was also the arrest and detention generally was also unlawful and a violation of Article 139 of the Constitution of Guyana. Alright, so looking at the issues there, right? The mistreatment amounted to torture, which are violations of the Guyanese Constitution. Got all of those different things, right? So a lot of different things were taken out here and looked at, right? It all looking at the different types of courts that were spoken to and all different types of international law that this breached, right? We look at the court itself, right, within Guyana, the Supreme Court, right, may have considered not to only look at the treatment of the law, right, but also the views and recommendation by treaty bodies and decisions, right. So the courts in Guyana also, with this case, look towards the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and European Court of Human Rights, right? What we're saying here is that this case was so gruesome, right, that the infringements, right, as it relates to inhumane treatment and torture violated not only Guyanese law, but multiple international laws, right? And this was meted out by the Guyanese police force in this case, right? So Thomas was awarded, right, some amount of compensation, right? So it was released and awarded, right? Some amount of compensation and will compensate her damages most likely, right? So the damages were is also another remedy of judicial review, right? So we'll look at that there. So totally, I think it was over $6 million, right? He was given. Looking at that case there. So those two cases are the most crucial as it relates to freedom from torture and inhumane treatment, right? The freedom of expression now, what's happening here? So freedom of expression, the wide range of forms of expression, including speech, art, music, and other forms of communication. It seeks to, it includes freedoms to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, through any media, right? So that's what really the free, expression really speaks about. The case law for freedom of expression is meted under John Benjamin versus the Minister of Information 2001 and Eloy de Freitas, right, versus the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Agriculture 1998. So these two, right? Both of them are actually Anguillan cases, right? So we have those two issues there, right? So the first case, John Benjamin, right, he basically was a part of a program called Talk Your Mind, right, on Radio Anguilla, right, and he posted criticisms, right, about different types of stuff, right? So criticisms, right, on the government and the government of a national lottery, right? So there was basically he was criticizing the government, right, for these various things, right? And he was actually detained for this issue, right? So looking at that, so there was an issue here. The Privy Council itself would have agreed that the judgment of the trial judge, right, specifically, right, and all the principal findings in this case has confirmed an award of damages for breach of the fundamental rights of expression. So what was happening here, right? He was criticizing the government, and the Minister of Information was not taking it, right? And there was an entire court case, right, and a complete declaration, right, that the person was supposed to be detained, right, for their criticisms, right. So we're looking at here that all citizens generally have the right to criticize, right, the right to express in a specific way, right. So this is a pinnacle case when you're looking at stuff like journalism and stuff like that, right? How these persons are protected. Eloy de Freitas, no, that's a case under the Civil Service Act, I believe. The Civil Service Act in Anguilla, right? But that case isn't generally used as much. We usually use John Benjamin versus the Minister of Information for a case there, right? We're looking at this now. So generally I just chose some of these to look at, right? Some of the most important ones and gave cases for all of them, right? Now for the state of emergency now, even though our fundamental rights and freedoms are enshrined within the Constitution, right, it is important to know that our rights and freedoms are conditional, meaning that you can't do something, right, and then you always win by saying, oh, it is my right, right? Your right is conditional and contingent upon the right of another, meaning that if you use your right of expression to discriminate, right, against a person, right, then that right of expression cannot be used in your defense, right? You cannot use your rights to infringe on other person's rights. It cannot work. It will not be used as defense. In order to receive equity, you must do equity. You can't use your rights to infringe on other person's rights. That's important. And we also have the state of emergency, right? So let's look at this. So a state of emergency would generally be a situation where the country itself or the area is within crisis, right? So it's expanded powers, right? We have expanded powers of the government to address with crisis, right? So this could mean some natural disaster, public health emergency, civil unrest, terrorist threats, etc., right? What we're looking at now is the government taking over more stringent control over the public, and they can suspend the fundamental rights and freedoms during the state emergency, right? So you can have your suspension of civil liberties, right? So it is temporary in nature. The suspension of rights will not continue after the emergency situation. So it will last as long as the emergency situation, only as long as the emergency persists, right? There's a legal basis for it. So there are legal provisions that allow the government to actually take away these rights in situations of emergency. Alright? There are also checks and balances. So even though the rights are taken away, generally are suppressed within states of emergency, there are usual mechanisms to prevent the abuse of power. So judicial review still persists. So even though Parliament can say, hey, okay, state of emergency, let's take away all these rights. Let's infringe our power on our let's infringe our power over the citizens in order to create a more stable society within the state of emergency. Right? That is fine, you know. But that doesn't mean that because these rights are suppressed means that you can go now and breach anything you want to breach. Because judicial review is there. The Supreme Court is still watching over the Parliament. Right? Especially within situations of emergency and states of emergency, the Supreme Court has to have their eyes on Parliament, right? And especially the enforcers of Parliament, the defense forces, the constabulary forces, etc. Right? The scope of the suspended rights as well. So the specific rights of freedom can be suspended in varying ways, right? And this is depending on the legal framework and the nature of the emergency, right? So commonly suspended rights are usually the freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, right, privacy rights, and habeas corpus, the right to be brought before a court, right? So looking at that, so why freedom of assembly, right? If there is an issue, right, a state of emergency, let's say crime level spike, right? The government can actually tell you that, okay, you no longer have a right to assemble, don't assemble in large groups. They can tell you that, right? You don't have freedom of movement. These are what curfews are for. They tell you that after a certain time, a period, you cannot move. And if found moving, you'd have breached the law. So it is a suspension, right, of your freedom of movement, right? Privacy rights as well. Police can come kick off your door, right, in states of emergency, all right? And you can't really say, oh, I have a right to... No. Privacy rights have been suspended. But that doesn't give the authorities power to abuse because those rights were not suspended. So the Supreme Court has to look now within these situations and to make sure that the rights that have been suspended are duly suspended, but the government is not taking, right, an extra mile. So yes, the police can kick off a door. Yes, there's nothing you can say about it. But the police can search and everything, but they do not have the right to touch or harm anyone. So looking at stuff like that. Habeas corpus now the right to be brought before a court. Alright, we're looking at those type of things that can be suspended as well. So they have proportional responsibilities now. Governments are generally expected to take measures, right, that are proportionate to the emergency, right? So somebody can't get shot downtown and them lock down the entire country. That don't make no sense, right? That doesn't make any sense at all, right? A specific civil unrest can't be happening in one parish and them lock down every other parish and suspend the freedom of speech. No. So it has to be proportionate. Human rights concerns must be taken into consideration as well, right? So even though the suspension of rights and freedoms are taking place within these emergency areas, right? You still have risk of abuse and discrimination. And it's important that governments uphold right, international human rights, right? We also have public support and transparency. Maintaining public support and transparency is crucial within states of emergency to make sure that the public can see what is happening and to make sure that the courts have power to look over and to make sure that any breach will be subject to judicial review. Right? That is really it there. Any questions? Before we move on to the case law. Okay, we have Jennifer Gary versus the Attorney General of Grenada. Alright, this is the case here. So what's happening in this case? Anybody knows this case? All right. So basically, what was happening here now? The plaintiff Jennifer Gary was an administratrix of the estate owned by her father Eric Gary, right? So within, hopefully law students would have been persons with history and those type of things, right? During the Maurice Bishop revolutionary government within Grenada, right? There was some property that was confiscated, right? As having been corruptly obtained, so confiscated by the government, right? And after the government was overthrown by force, the new democratically elected government, right, came to power and the revolutionary laws were repealed. Right? So what's happening now? The plaintiff would have succeeded with a case, right, applying to actually return all these assets, right, back to the estate, right? We're looking at that. Okay, so you're trying to get back all of these things back to the assets. The plaintiff would have succeeded in the case for a declaration that the assets must be that were unlawfully confiscated must be returned, and the government failed to pay due failed to pay her, right, the appropriate amount of compensation, right? So what she did now, she went and appealed for the payment of monies, right, due to the estate for an order of the imprisonment of the Minister of Finance if he did not comply with the order. So basically, she threatened the Minister of Finance, right, if damages weren't provided, if proper compensation wasn't given, right? So what was the issue here now? What was the main issue here? So the issue was whether or not, right, the mandatory order provided, right, was deemed as legal or illegal, right, as being made against the crown. The High Court and the Court of Appeal held that the court had no jurisdiction to make such an order. She appealed to the Privy Council, which was prepared to create a new remedy in public law, right? So the Privy Council had created a new remedy in public law for this issue, right? So I think Lord Bingham would have been the person who actually provided some obiter dictum, which would have been important for this case. So he said that having proved a breach of right protected by the Constitution, having obtained a money judgment, and having failed to obtain full payment, the appellant now seeks an effective, not merely a nominal remedy, right? We don't want just a nominal remedy, we want an effective remedy there. So the court has power to grant such a remedy, and if it is necessary to fashion a new remedy to give effective relief, the court may do so within the broad limits of Section 16 of the Grenadian Constitution. Right? So what occurred here now? The court must be ready to exercise the power to grant effective relief for any contravention of the protected constitutional rights. That's what was set out in that case. Right? So the case, I hope you guys go through enough cases to read them. So it's a case that doesn't really show up a lot, right? But it's used to explain the enforcement of protective provisions under the Constitution, especially when there was a state of emergency. Alright? The remedies now, there are different remedies set out for fundamental rights. We have damages, which was covered by John Reynolds versus the AG for St. Kitts and Nevis and Anguilla in 1976. Right? So damages specifically. Okay. So we have that there. Alright. So we have that case there. We also have declarations. So declarations set out the parties' rights basically. So it's a basic statement that basically it's a statement, right? A discretionary remedy which the court may refuse where its award would serve no useful purpose. So basically a declaration, right, is basically a statement, right? It's fundamentally a statement that sets out a party's rights, right? So you have a declaration there. So you can't give a declaration can be given, right, to a citizen, right? Especially for breach of any type of natural justice. We have injunctions, we know what injunctions are, and we have imprisonment, and we know what imprisonment is, right? So those are general remedies that are given under breaches for fundamental rights. So given that this is just a review of the topic, hopefully we have gone through these already. Alright? Everything here should be fine. That was really the fundamental rights section. Not really much to see there.